Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Prime Minister Modi's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping seems to have established a strong personal rapport between both leaders. Though scheduled for 40 minutes, it lasted for over 80. So are relations between Beijing and Delhi about to significantly change? That's the discussion in part 2. But first, the controversy about Vedic's meeting with Hafiz Saeed. Very few journalists have interviewed Hafiz Saeed and none from India before Mr Vedic. Even Pakistani and Western journalists are often denied access. So could there be more to Mr Vedic's interview than perhaps meets the eye? That's the first debate tonight. And now joining me to talk about how easy or difficult is access to Hafiz Saeed is one of Pakistan's best-known security analysts, Aisha Siddiqa, the BBC's South Asia correspondent Andrew North, PTI's former correspondent in Pakistan and now a senior journalist with Mail Today, Raza-ul-Lashkar, and former Joint Secretary at RNAW, Jayadev Ranade. Aisha Siddiqa, after the news broke that Vaidik had met Hafiz Saeed and interviewed him, you tweeted that you have never had access to Hafiz Saeed, and for the sake of the Indian audience, I'll add, that's despite the fact you're probably Pakistan's leading strategic authority on the army. You also said that Saeed is controlled at the highest level of the Pakistan Army and the ISI. So let me ask you, how closely do they watch him and how difficult is access to the man?
See, firstly, my point was not that he's controlled by the highest rungs of the army or the ISI. My point was that he, normally you do not get clearance if you're not, considered friendly by the military. You need, that kind of a nod as well. It is difficult to see him. I've tried many a times. I've tried to contact. In fact, couple of times that I've tried, it's been a disappointment. I do not get access. And I'm as much, an academic or a journalist as anybody else. The other point which I'd like to correct is that I think earlier on when people have visited, Indian academics have visited Pakistan, similar offers were made to them. I remember a couple of years ago that there were a bunch of journalists who had visited, and in that particular case they were asked by, offered by, none other than Mubashir Luqman, if I remember the conversation correctly, that he had said that he could arrange a meeting between them and Hafiz Saeed. In this case, they had not agreed to see him. So the issue is not just who is allowed to access him; it's also who is willing to see him. In this particular case,
can I stop you there? The first half of your answer had a critical sentence where you seemed to suggest that in a way the gatekeepers to Mr. Saeed were the army and the ISI.
Well, he's close to them, so that is my understanding. At least this is my perception from my own experience.
So unless
one doesn't get to see them,
and unless the army and the ISI clear it, you won't get to see Hafiz Saeed. That's the corollary. Is that right?
I think it's in certain critical cases where they're looking very closely and carefully. Mr. Vedic, by the way, had also come and visited me. I'm not somebody who'd be on his list, but he got my number from somewhere, came to see me and all of that. And what I remember distinctly from this meeting, which went on for over an hour, that there was a lot of names that he took. It seemed that he had a lot of connections in the Indian government. So I'm assuming that what might have happened is that he might have been able to impress people who would have thought that it was probably he would act as a good emissary between the Modi government and the LET.
Raza-ul-Lashkar, you spent 5 years in Pakistan as the Press Trust of India's correspondent. I imagine you must have repeatedly tried to either interview or to at least meet Hafiz Saeed. What sort of response did you get each time you made an effort?
Well, I still, I have contacts with the people in the JUD, the spokespersons and people like that. There were innumerable instances when, they would call me and ask me to attend a function that was being addressed by Hafiz Saeed. And I have attended several events where Hafiz Saeed spoke. But every single request for an interview in the 5+ years that I was there was turned down. I mean, it was after Mumbai, even before Mumbai. But every single instance, I was told that he wouldn't be willing to talk to an Indian journalist.
I'm just going to underline this for the sake of the audience. Every single request for an interview was turned down, despite the fact you were resident in Pakistan, you were PTI's official correspondent, and despite the fact that when Hafiz Saeed was addressing meetings, his people would ring you up and ask you to attend the meeting to cover it, but they wouldn't grant an interview.
Sure, that's exactly the point. I mean, I think I must have covered at least more than a dozen or half a dozen, at least more than half a dozen meetings at which he personally spoke, and he did speak against India. I mean, these were events to which both me and the Hindus correspondents used to be invited, but we were never given an interview.
Short of an interview, were you ever allowed to meet him one-to-one?
No. I mean, the closest was, I think, I possibly stood about 4 or 5 feet away from him at an event outside the Islamabad Press Club.
With a lot of other people.
With a lot of other people.
But no opportunity to walk up and have a conversation, no opportunity to meet one-to-one for background conversation?
Nothing of the sort.
Absolutely nothing. Andrew North, you managed an interview with Hafiz Saeed as the BBC South Asia correspondent, which was broadcast by your channel on the 30th of June. That's just 16 days ago. How easy was it to get access to Hafiz Saeed? Was it simply a question of picking up the phone and making an appointment? Or did you have to wait for months, struggle to get the interview?
It's very interesting hearing these other accounts that have just gone before, because basically we did just pick up the phone. I was in Pakistan, it's part of my beat. I was there just a few weeks ago, and actually because we haven't heard much from him, he hasn't done many interviews for a while, I thought it'd be interesting to call. So we put a call into the JUD office, Jammat-Ud-Dawah, and a day later they called back and they said that Hafiz Saeed would do an interview with us. Now, at that particular time came news, just after we'd made the call, that the Americans had imposed these new sanctions on JUD and on LET, and it may be that he thought that this was a good time to speak out against those sanctions, as of course he did, on the BBC. But certainly it was not difficult. It seems like at that particular point he was ready to talk. We simply drove down to Lahore. We met him in one of his madrasa offices in the centre of the city. It was all very relaxed, and I think that was actually very telling in itself, that it was relatively easy to meet him. And of course this is a man who is still under a $10 million US bounty.
I'll just underline for the audience 3 important bits of your answer. First of all, this wasn't something you'd been planning for a while. It was almost spur of the moment. Secondly, within 24 hours of your making a request to interview him, the interview was granted. And thirdly, it happened in one of his madrasa offices in the center of Lahore. It didn't happen at Murid Ke, the special premises or compounds that the JUD or LET have.
That's right. It was quicker than I expected. Certainly, as I say, he seemed willing to speak, and when we turned up, we turned up first, and then a short while afterwards, he came in with an entourage, but there was no visible security. There were no checks or anything, and this is right in the middle of Lahore. So it certainly seemed very relaxed, but clearly someone was happy for us to be able to talk to him.
When you say someone was happy for you to be able to talk to him, are you hinting that the army and the ISI might have been informed by Saeed's people that you were coming and had cleared the path for you? Is that what you're suggesting?
I have no idea, but of what conversations may have gone on behind the scenes, but I do know that several colleagues in the foreign press in Islamabad have been trying for some time to talk to him, and they also have had trouble reaching him. He hasn't done an interview, as far as I'm aware, for the Western media, for the foreign media in Pakistan, for at least a couple of years. I think the last time was after the bounty was put on his head. And so it may simply be that he decided this was a good time to talk. But certainly the impression you get is that he is a protected man, and that he knows that, and that's why he was able to be very relaxed in this context.
Mr. Ranade, as someone who's probably kept a beady eye as an intelligence officer on the situation in Pakistan and on Hafiz Saeed in particular, would I be right in assuming that Hafiz Saeed would be much more willing to make himself available periodically to Western journalists because he wants to win their approval in some shape and form, if he can, but he would be very reluctant to meet Indians because he knows that Indians are going to ask him awkward questions about Kashmir which he doesn't want to have to answer. Am I right in that assumption?
More or less. The point is, if he has a story to tell, if he has a message to put out, that is the time he would choose for an interview, which is what he seems to have done with the other panelists. As far as access to him is concerned, I think it's very tightly regulated. After all, the LET and the Jammat-Ud-Dawah, which is, I mean, the new name for the LET, are both tightly controlled by the army and the ISI. So access to him is cleared by them. On that, there is, I think, little doubt.
Aisha Siddiqa, I want to pick up and explore that critical sentence which you mentioned earlier on when you said that in a very real sense the army and the ISI act as gatekeepers to him. Without their clearance, no one can go and meet him. If therefore Ved Pratap Vaidik had an easy time getting through to and meeting Saeed and spent a fair amount of time with him, would that therefore suggest that the army or the ISI actually facilitated the meeting?
See, he mentions himself that he went through a television, journalist, a known anchor, that's what he said. I'm assuming a couple of people who are in Islamabad who actually boast about, being in touch with Hafiz Saeed and introducing people to Hafiz Saeed. Now, those are the kind of characters who are, again, known to be, friendly towards the military. So that is the fact. Now, I would kind of draw your attention towards the point that you insist on making, that of course they are gatekeepers. There is a link between them, the military and Hafiz Saeed, no doubt about that. But the thing is that whether they strictly look at his schedule, whom he meets or not, that needs to be looked carefully into. Now, in this particular case, as I can imagine what might have happened is that he would have probably managed to impress enough people, because as I told you earlier, the 1 hour meeting that I had with him, he seemed to be so close to the new Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and different people in his government. I mean, he would talk about them on first name basis, that I'm sure he must have impressed somebody. And in this particular case, even if the military was not gatekeeping, they would have definitely looked at who was meeting Hafiz Saeed. I mean, there is an Indian journalist who who claims to have, yeah.
Are you therefore suggesting that because of the way Mr. Vedic was dropping names and underlining an affinity or closeness to the new government, that people assumed, rightly or wrongly, that he either was an intermediary or that he perhaps had a message and that he had some connection to the government, and therefore there was a great utility in putting him in touch with Hafiz Saeed, a greater utility than simply putting a journalist in touch?
See, precisely, and I would also refer to one of my earlier responses. I remember 2 years ago there was a bunch of Indian journalists who were visiting Islamabad, and one of the prominent television anchors, again supposedly who's considered as being very close to the military establishment, Mubashir Luqman, he had offered these journalists that he would take them to Hafiz Saeed if they wanted to seek an interview. So such offers have been made. Now, in this particular case, here is an old gentleman who seems to have or claims to have these very contacts directly to the Prime Minister's office. Now, in that case, they're probably trying to build an understanding or to let him have a peek into, what Hafiz Saeed looks like, and to present this thing that, he's not as dangerous a man as Indians believe him to be. And probably, Mr. Vedic went in to assess what Hafiz Saeed was all about.
Okay, that's a fairly comprehensive answer that we're getting from Aisha Siddiqa, and she's clearly suggesting two things there. One, that journalists who are close to the army acted as sort of gatekeepers in a sense, but clearly the army and ISI would have been aware of what they were arranging. And secondly, that they felt that it was important for a man who gave the impression of being so closely connected to the Vajpayee government to actually end up meeting a man like Hafiz Saeed. It would have been useful to Hafiz Saeed. Do you think there can be any other possible explanation for this meeting? I want to be absolutely honest to Mr. Vedic and explore any other possible explanation. Could it just be sheer luck?
I don't think so. I mean, you don't get a meeting with Hafiz Saeed through luck. There's very little left to chance in this sort of a situation. I mean, I was just going back to what Aisha was saying also earlier. I mean, if you really look at it, in the last few years, there are only a handful of Pakistani journalists who have interviewed Hafiz Saeed. I mean, it's just the same 3 or 4 journalists. Mubashir Luqman is one of them. Hamid Mir is the other one. There's another chap called Kamran Shahid. He hasn't spoken to anyone else. And there was one instance of an Indian journalist who visited Pakistan, I think it was a couple of years ago, and he wanted to go and film near Hafiz Saeed's house. And we told him repeatedly not to do it. And when he did do that, he was picked up by plainclothes civilian security personnel, and his passport was seized, his documents were seized, and he had to be thrown out.
And to note, as you said, Hafiz Saeed doesn't give too many interviews. In fact, as far as I can tell, in the last 4 years, he's even done just 3 with the Western media. There was Robert Fisk of The Independent in 2010, Declan Walsh of the New York Times in 2013, and yours on the 30th of June this year. Do you get the feeling that, in fact, he protects himself from journalists, and particularly journalists who want to inquire into his jihadi and his terrorist activities?
Absolutely, and I have no doubt that we happened to call at a time when he wanted to talk, and whoever is behind him was happy for that to go ahead. Clearly, the BBC was a useful medium for them right then to put across their message. But we asked him tough questions. We basically, I said to him, you're an obstacle as long as you carry on saying these things about India, about Kashmir. There is no hope of anything moving on as long as you're not prepared to put yourself up before independent courts to test. Of course, he says he's innocent of the Mumbai attacks. Then nothing can change. He turned that round by saying that India focuses on me because it wants to divert attention from what he called his occupation of Kashmir. And it's very clear that he has thought out his whole platform very carefully. He also seems very comfortable, and that came across very clearly in the interview.
Can I put this to you? You said that he made himself available because shortly after you made your request, in fact, America announced that JUD itself, his present organization, would be considered a terrorist organization. Therefore, did you get the feeling that he gives an interview when it suits his purpose, and he tries to use the interview to put across his message or his representation or his viewpoint, and therefore there's a certain clever thoughtfulness behind the way he chooses interviewers and who he grants interviews to?
Maybe so, but I mean, of course, in that respect, that's the same as anyone who agrees to do an interview. They obviously have a point of view to put across, we as journalists, our job is simply to ring people up, see what they've got to say, and then test them. But so yes, of course, he's trying to put across a platform, and he's had a very long time to think about it. But I think the telling thing ultimately is how relaxed he was. Clearly he feels protected. He doesn't, despite the fact of having this bounty on his head, he doesn't feel the need for any visible security around him, and he is able to give these interviews in a very relaxed context. I mean, we had a lot of time with him. There was no pressure on time, and so I think it was the kind of the atmosphere of the interview that was as telling as what he said.
Tell me, Mr. Ranade, why do you think Hafiz Saeed would have agreed to meet Mr. Vedic? Clearly, Mr. Vedic, he would have known, is not a conventional mainstream journalist. Therefore, he would have known that this interview that he's giving would not appear as a Q&A in a paper, or it wouldn't appear on a television channel. Was he therefore himself using Mr. Vedic to send messages to the Indian government? Or was he hoping that this would create some sort of furor in India, as it clearly has, and this would put him center stage as far as Indian politics and Indian politicians are concerned for a while.
Quite right, Karan. The one thing we should keep in mind is that most intelligence agencies create or use platforms that are already available for opinion molding, influencing opinion, and reaching out to various people. And I think the particular platform that was used in Islamabad this time is one such. About Mr. Vedic dropping names and therefore being noticed, I somehow disagree. I think before calling the delegation, which comprised 14 people, they must have checked out each one and targeted certain people for an invitation. We don't know, of course, whether Vedic was the only one or there were some others also.
Okay.
But in any case, there was a purpose in inviting him. And I think, as you said, one or two things they've achieved. One, to either sow some kind of discord here, and second, to get publicity for Hafiz Saeed in India.
Very quickly, Aisha Siddiqa, because we're sadly running out of time. As you know, the Vedic episode has created a furore in India. How has the Pakistani media, how have your politicians viewed the reaction in India?
I think we are barely even noticing. There is nothing in the Pakistani press. I think there is nothing, peculiar about what we know that, we have heard that Indians are upset, but nobody in the media is covering it. Very quick point that I would also like to bring to your attention is that Mr. Vedic and few other journalists and some Congress politicians like Manishankar Iyer, Salman Khurshid, etc., they were part of this delegation which was invited to a track to organized by an institute which has on its board of advisors person like General Ehsan, who's a former
and your former foreign minister Kusuri, who is in fact the moving force behind the organization. The organization is known over here. The organization is known over here. The main point that I want to register for the audience is that actually the response and reaction in India is virtually unknown in Pakistan. It hasn't been covered by your media. It hasn't created any stir or any response. Am I right very quickly in that?
Yes, very right.
Raza, tell me this. The ISI, if they did arrange the meeting, which we all assume they did, what were they hoping for? Would they have anticipated this reaction? Clearly they must have. And how then are they responding to it? What do they make of it? How do they benefit from it?
You know, I mean, as Mr. Ranade said, it was a perfect opportunity to put Hafiz Saeed right in the center of things, you know. I mean, get his views across, that he wants to come across to India and clear his name and stuff like that. I mean, so if it was a ISI operation, they've obviously scored very well. But I would really like to know from Mr. Vaidik what really was the reason why he went for this meeting, because he hasn't done an interview.
Well, we actually asked him that question when he was on the show yesterday, and he said it was simply curiosity, an opportunity to try and understand and at first hand get to know a man who he was curious about and to understand his motivations. That's his explanation. Very quickly, Andrew North, we're running out of time. Did he impress you as an interviewee?
He was very composed. He has clearly thought long and hard about his position. As I said already, he was certainly very comfortable. And I also remember talking to a Pakistani general because at that particular time the North Waziristan operation was getting going. Some have made the comparison saying, well, Hafiz Saeed is part of the problem that Pakistan has to deal with. And this general was very clear that although the North Waziristan operation, as he saw it, was going after all bad militants, Hafiz Saeed was very clearly not part of that. And so, again, this kind of gives you this picture that people like Hafiz Saeed are seen as loyal. And that's why, of course, there is very likely to be very little pressure against him, and why he is going to be able to carry on giving these kinds of interviews.
And why he feels so completely safe, and why perhaps he's even given security, as Robert Fisk said, by armed Pakistani soldiers outside his office. You're absolutely right. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me.